My name is Alex Hochuli and I'm producer and chair of this session at the Energy Challenge, Can We Keep the Lights On? First of all, I'd like to thank Shell for partnering us on this session. As we've only got 60 minutes, we should get started. So I'll introduce the speakers and I'll do that in the order in which they'll speak. So speaking first, on my right, on your left, is Martin Haig, who is an energy consultant at Shell. Martin led the development of Shell's world energy model, and he worked in Shell Scenarios team for the last 5 years, including working on Shell's behalf with MIT's climate science team. His background is in mathematics, and before working in Shell Scenarios team, he worked in mathematical and economic modelling and in the railways and telecoms industry. Speaking second on my left is the other Martin, Martin Wright, who's a journalist, editor, broadcaster and commentator on environmental solutions and sustainable futures. He's editor-in-chief of Green Futures, the UK's leading magazine on the subject, published by Forum for the Future. And as a writer and photographer, he's contributed to an extensive range of publications and programmes. And he's also visiting judge for the Ashton Awards for Sustainable Energy and is a fellow of the RSA. And speaking third, to my immediate right is Joe Kaplinski, who's a science writer and researcher. He's carried out experimental research in low-temperature physics and most recently in biophysics. He's worked as a patent analyst and written and contributed to debates on many topics dealing with science, risk and democracy. Finally, he's a co-author with James Woodhousen of Energize, A Future for Energy Innovation, which I understand is for sale at Foyle's Bookshop, which I would encourage you to check out if you haven't yet done so.
This is quite a topical issue for me, because a week and a half ago, the ageing electrics in my flat fused, and I had a very frantic day scrabbling around to get an electrician to fix it. The coincidence was that it coincided with your email talking about the logistics of the day, and you said we'd have 5 to 7 minutes, so I see we've been granted grace of another minute. But you also you talked about the logistics, and then the title of the talk, Can We Keep the Lights On? So I'm now fearing an email from you about sea level rise and the Thames breaching its barriers, because I live in a basement flat, Alex. Anyway, on this question, I think it's worth distilling a few sort of points out of it. The first one is that we all know there's a world energy issue, and the key issue there is meeting the rising demand in a sustainable way. Within energy, there's topics around electricity specifically, hence the question about keeping the lights on. And in Britain, we have a particular issue because we know we have lots of very old power stations, lots of which have got to shut down. There are other countries as well. South Africa is in the energy news a lot over their struggles with their electricity supply. Lots of the developing world countries are struggling with this as well. We'll assume for now that we're focusing on UK electricity, but if other people who've got a broader interpretation of this question want to ask questions more broadly, then that's absolutely fine. So the question about the UK and our electricity is we have a lot of old power stations that we've got to shut down in the next few years. What can we build in their place if we've got the time? I think that's the fear behind the question. Now, first of all, I think I'd say that I do believe that transforming our energy system is one of the biggest challenges that we face of our lifetimes and will be relevant for the rest of our lifetimes. But on the specific UK short to medium term electricity issue, I believe, in answer to this question, we ought to be able to keep the lights on, that is, or if we don't, we'd be badly mess it up if we weren't to. Now, that's not to be complacent. My role, as you introduced, is computer modelling Shell, so always, as colleagues will know, first recourse to the numbers. So I hope you will bear with me, but this might provide some useful sort of background. We have about 85 gigawatts of electricity capacity in total in the country at the moment. About half of that is coal and nuclear, and it's coal and nuclear that is the key here because they're the old ones that we've got to shut down. So half the capacity, and also about half of the electricity that's generated comes from that coal and the nuclear. The amount of electricity generated varies a little bit depending on how well used the coal power stations are, but it's around 50%. There are 3 factors at play. There are 2 EU directives that will affect coal, and then there's the ageing nuclear power stations that are coming to the end of their life. The EU directives are the Large Combustion Plant Directive, LCPD, which is going to involve us shutting 12 of our 29 gigawatts of coal by 2016. So we've only got about 5 more years of life of those. That's in place, that's running. There's another directive which is currently being discussed, which is the Industrial Emissions Directive. Maybe people in here know more about it than I do, but as far as I'm aware, this is still under negotiation, both in its scope and the timing. But on the current drafting, that might mean another 10 gigawatts closed by around 2020 or 2021. So that's a total of 22 of our 29 gigawatts of coal going within a decade. We have 11 gigawatts of nuclear, 7 of that is scheduled to shut by 2020. So out of our 85, we have 14 going by 2015 and 29 going by 2020 or so. So a little over a third of it has got to go within a decade. But probably the critical issue is the stuff in the first 5 years. That's on the one side, the old stuff that's being shut down. The flip side of the coin is we have our environmental commitments. The EU target is for a 20% use of renewable energy by 2020. The UK, being a late starter, was given a slightly more easier target, so we've got 15%, although given where we started from, that's still quite tough. Now, electricity has to take the lion's share of that effort, so that's 15% of all energy. This will probably translate to about 30 to 35% of our electricity coming from renewables by 2020. That is a big, big challenge from where we are today. For Britain, what that largely means is a major offshore wind building programme, as everybody knows. Last week, when I looked up the numbers, we had just over 5 gigawatts of wind installed in the country, 1.3 of which was offshore. The government's target is for 32 gigawatts to be built by 2020. Now, that sounds like it equates to the 29 that we've got to shut down. There are two issues. Most of the wind is coming later in the decade, but also a gigawatt of wind doesn't give you as much energy as a gigawatt of nuclear or coal, so you probably need about double that. Now, the snags with the wind are the cost and how quickly we can absorb that amount of wind into the electricity system in that time. That's the backup question. Now, fortunately, it's not all doom and gloom. There is one option that we can build at the gigawatt scale cheaply and in time, and that, as everybody knows, is gas-fired power stations. And the good news is that when they're replacing coal power stations, you end up reducing your CO2 emissions compared with what you would have done. Now, a lot of green folk criticise gas because it's not the ideal solution. Without CCS, without carbon capture and storage, we shouldn't do it. However, I think Voltaire's quote that the perfect is the enemy of the good is probably very appropriate for that, given where we find ourselves today. So I would argue that the challenge we face today is to invest in wind and gas now, wind as much as we can afford, because that's going to put the cost of our electricity up. So that's a political process as to how much we can afford collectively, but do as much as we can afford, and do gas to keep the lights on, to stop our electricity bills from rising too much and to reduce the sort of CO2 relative to the coal. And at the same time as doing that, actually deploying the wind and the gas, then we need to keep working on the nuclear and the carbon capture and the storage over the next decade so that we actually have the scale to deploy that at the gigawatt capacity in the 2020s.
That was wonderfully expert and precise, which is great. I'm going to sort of pull back the focus a bit, like the generalist that I am. So the question, can we keep the lights on? There's a fear-filled premise to that question, isn't there? A sort of, oh my God, the lights might go out. Arg! Which I don't think really does us justice, either as a country or a species. So I'd rather reframe it. I'd rather ask, how can we best keep the lights on and the wheels turning and our homes warm, etc., for ourselves and for others across the world? How can we get all that and get other things we want too, like security, like health, like an amenable climate, and above all, the chance for a better quality of life, not just in Britain, but in, say, Bangladesh as well? It's an urgent question. It's also a question that I think carries with it a wave of opportunities too. So first, on the urgency, 3 key points here. You've heard of some of them. One, it's clear that certain energy resources we've come to rely on are starting to diminish in quantity and quality. Obviously, that's particularly true of oil. We're not physically diminishing, they're becoming harder to get at. We consume more energy getting them, it's more expensive to do so, and is in danger in some cases of causing more problems than it solves. Secondly, the way we get and use much of our energy today, as we've heard, is messing with the climate. This hasn't stopped happening just because sections of the media, most of them blissfully uninformed by atmospheric science, have decided it's gone out of fashion, that climate change is so last year, darlings. I'm very lucky through my job with the Ashton Awards to travel a certain amount, particularly to rural areas of the developing world. I've recently been in East Africa and northern India, and there people who never read The Guardian and never get informed by propaganda from warmists or anything like that talk a great deal about the way the climate is changing at a speed which they're totally unfamiliar with. And thirdly, energy security. The third of our urgent issues, energy security. We are arguably dangerously dependent on energy imports from volatile areas of the globe. Our supply lines in military metaphors are long and vulnerable. That dependency has dragged us into one stupid war, and it might well do so again unless we can find ways to drastically reduce it. For the most part, energy security is a problem we remain unaware of until it jumps up and bites us. I can't help thinking that as and when, this is not a suggestion by the way, but as and when Al-Qaeda finally get their act together and carry out a coordinated strike on the major oil ports of the Arabian Gulf, and it stuns me they've not attempted this yet, we will be reminded just how insecure our present infrastructure is, our present oil infrastructure is. Now all this, of course, is on top of a looming squeeze in electricity generation capacity here in the UK, which Martin's referred to, which largely has nothing to do with those points I've raised above. It's already hardwired into the regulatory landscape, as it were. At least it's having the virtue of focusing minds on the whole energy issue. So that's the urgent bit. That's the sort of environmentalist cri de coeur, the call for action. Faced with this, I think too many people, especially environmentalists, respond with a sort of orgy of fear and gloom. Environmentalists have been experts at making people feel bad about themselves to absolutely no effect. I know what I'm talking about because I was one of them. 30 years ago as a student, I used to hurl invective at people for standing by and watching the devastation of the Amazon rainforest. And 3 decades on, guess what? There's a whole lot less rainforest now than there was then. Not that we've learned our lessons, witnessed that spectacularly crap video put out by the 1010 campaign, which is probably the most striking own goal by the environmental movement for many years. You remember the one of the people asking the children, the teacher asking the children if they'd done their bit for reduce their carbon footprint, and if they hadn't, they put their hands up and then they got blown to pieces. Spectacularly ineffective and just showing the environmental movement still hasn't learned the first thing about how to motivate people rather than terrify them. Sending people on guilt trips doesn't work. I think the only way is to get people excited about future possibilities, and when it comes to energy, that's the only way we're going to crack this. It's the only way we're going to get political enthusiasm and business engagement with it. I think our response to this energy challenge must be to unleash a wave of creativity and ingenuity not seen since the Industrial Revolution, with some of the same moral purpose that the Victorians had for improving people's lives. The two should go together. So we need, in broad terms, very broad terms, we need to harness the power of disruptive innovation, challenging existing patterns in energy generation and consumption, so as to achieve breakthroughs on a life-changing scale. If that sounds far-fetched, think of what's happened with the internet or mobile phones. Who in 1980 or 1990 even could have imagined that the average Bangladeshi would have access to a mobile communications device which we could only dream of? Things sometimes happen surprisingly quickly, and they can happen for the good surprisingly quickly. We need entrepreneurs who are going to take us there. We need governments to set a lead and maintain it even in the face of short-term political unpopularity. Now, in practice, that means 3 things. First, exploiting each and every opportunity to generate power through renewable sources, ones which don't contribute to climate change, which don't, for the most part, rely on massively vulnerable supply chains, and which aren't subject to volatile price rises in their fuel because, in general, the fuel is free. Solar, wind, wave, tidal, biomass to some extent, biofuels to some extent. Second, to recognise, as Martin implied, we're not going to shift to a renewable economy overnight or even within a generation or two. So we need to make the way we use and distribute energy a whole lot smarter, using IT, using so-called smart grids, using continental interconnectors, using energy storage technologies, etc., etc. All of these have a potential we're only beginning to grasp. Third, we need to start finding energy efficiency really sexy. We need to remember that the best way to use a ton of coal or a barrel of oil is not to use it at all. It's worth remembering this is a bit of a provocative point, but we don't actually need energy as such, not like we need food and we need water. We need the things which energy can give us. At the moment, we get the two slightly confused, I think partly because energy has been so cheap, relatively speaking, in the West for so long, and the consequences of using it have been so hidden. It means energy efficiency, particularly, has always been a poor relation, and a relation which most people find is extraordinarily dull. It's why environmentalists who should know better do ridiculous things like putting one of those little micro wind turbines on the top of their uninsulated loft. a little spinning badge of commitment, these little micro wind turbines, saying I'm generating my own energy and I'm excited about it, even if it won't pay its way till 100 years after I'm dead. Insulating your loft, of course, by contrast, will pay its way within a few months. Energy demand is rising not because we have an ineluctable demand for more and more energy, but we have a rising demand for the stuff which energy provides, for warmth, for coolness, for light, for mobility, for access to the global economy. I think to imagine that we can only ever satisfy this through ever greater supplies of power is to be, well, deeply unimaginative. Now, one of the things that will spur both greater efficiency and clean energy innovations is if the price of high carbon fuels goes up, not in the chaos of panic on the futures markets, but because of a steady, predictable rise on the basis of a global carbon price signalled well in advance. If that extends to global carbon trading, so much the better. It will be a spur to innovation. It will be a huge boost to low-carbon countries like Bangladesh too. I keep coming back to Bangladesh. It's the country I'm lucky enough to have visited quite a few times, looking at the way sustainable energy is being implemented there. Some tremendously positive stories from a country like that. And I think it's worth closing with one. Rather than always worrying ourselves sick over whether we can keep the lights on in Britain, as if we haven't got enough of them, it's nice to look at how the lights are being switched on in rural Bangladesh, how people are getting solar power, millions upon millions of people are getting affordable solar power, replacing dirty kerosene. They're getting clean electric light, they're getting access to the global economy via their mobile phones. They're getting this in a way which seamlessly is both tackling climate change and it's lifting people out of poverty. It's improving their quality of life, and equally crucially, it's giving them some control and some ownership over their energy. Technologically, it's not a precise model for Britain as such, obviously, but in terms of the attitude, I think it's spot on. Thank you.
I like Martin Wright's technological optimism and the sense of giving people more. I think I disagree with the emphasis on efficiency. We can maybe, and using less energy, I think we'll use more, but maybe we can discuss that in the discussion. I think the more immediate problem is that you're perhaps underestimating the kind of barriers and the strength of the consensus today, which are actually rejecting the kind of positive vision that you're wanting to put forward. So, just an example, people may have been following this year, there's a Radio 4 series, History of the World in 100 Objects, taking 100 objects in the British Museum and telling the history of the world through their stories. It recently concluded, and they made a bit of a point out of choosing a final 100th object which would reflect and really sum up the 21st century and kind of put some weight on this. And the object that they landed up choosing was a solar-powered lamp, the sort of thing that can go out in Bangladesh, as Martin was talking about. And I think there's a couple of significant things about this. First, it really shows today the extent to which energy has become a way in which we think about the world and think about the future and how much is invested in this. And if you look back over the 99 other objects covering the rest of world history, they were all invested with some kind of symbolic value. They were religious, artistic, spiritual, ritual, many of them monetary, obviously often kind of carrying the heads of rulers and these sorts of things. Today for the 21st century, the thing that we attempt to invest with that kind of symbolic weight seems to be this solar-powered charger. You have to go so far back on the list to find something so everyday and utilitarian. Back in their first week, the kind of hand axe from the dawn of humanity was kind of about the last time there was this kind of utilitarian tool. And, I think this really speaks to the poverty of imagination in society today. There's a reduction of the energy question to energy as an end in itself, or energy as a means of survival. Society has lost sight of those kind of moral, religious, artistic questions that could inspire us and move us on. What are we going to do with this energy? That is something that I think we need to rescue and value. And I think without that, the kind of discussion about energy is going to be impoverished. The second point that I would make about the solar-powered lamp is the lack of ambition and the kind of small scale there. Rather than the sense that we can expand the large-scale centralised grids that we have in the Western developed world, the sorts of things that are keeping our lights on. We have kind of fairly makeshift kind of solution that can maybe help people in poverty, perhaps better than nothing, but nonetheless the expectation seems to be that they're not going to aspire to a real level of development there. In that sense, as a kind of snapshot, it sums that up fairly clearly. To move on to what's possible and what are the real barriers and possibilities. I mean, I think it's quite right that there are many kind of technical possibilities, and we shouldn't kind of get hung up on the idea that there are natural limits to how far we can go here. There's plenty of space more for innovation. I mean, to take briefly perhaps 3 objects that might presage a future of energy. You can look at historically something like uranium ore, mentioned yesterday as something which historically took a long while to unlock the potential of that. I mean, you look at the name of uranium ore, the pitch blend from the German blend, meaning blind. The miners could tell from the look and the feel of it that it contained a metal. It's just they couldn't get it out, and that's what they were blind to, but way back in the 15th century. It took, several centuries for the uranium first to be found out of there, for radioactivity to be discovered, and not until, the 20th century that we got the development of nuclear energy. I think you look at an object as ordinary and everyday as pure water. Tremendous potential for future technological developments. I mean, there's no time to talk about how remarkable water is for something that we take for granted, but you look at development of artificial photosynthesis, what that's really going to do there is kind of split the hydrogen out of water, releasing the oxygen as plants do, use that as a kind of chemical feedstocks for future fuels. And thirdly, something like carbon, the basis of fossil fuels, but the idea that we're going to have some kind of low carbon economy, I think we have to recognise is fairly absurd, given the centrality of carbon to the whole of chemistry. You look at Primo Levi, great chemist and writer of the 20th century, in his biography he wrote, The Periodic Table, stories about each of the elements and how, as a chemist you develop a particular set of memories and experiences with each element, summing up at the end when he came to carbon. He makes the point that, so it happens therefore that every element says something to someone, something different to each, like the mountain valleys or beaches visited in youth. One must perhaps make an exception for carbon because it says everything to everyone. That such is the kind of centrality of carbon to chemistry. And I think what we're going to see is not so much a low carbon economy as an economy which takes control of carbon in the generation of new fuels, in the management of carbon in the atmosphere and in the biosphere. Just to end with another example, I guess, of the perhaps false optimism on the part of the environmentalists. You look at the presentation of a positive choice from someone like Al Gore. The title of his latest book, it's entitled Our Choice, implying that he's placing kind of great emphasis and importance on humans choosing their future. But, you scratch the surface there and it turns out that the choice that's proposed is very constrained. Because what he's anticipating is a judgment on the present by future generations. And our choice is between explaining to future generations how we solved the climate crisis, or alternatively explaining how we allowed the destruction of civilization. A very clear kind of secularization of the day of judgment there. The choice is in fact a decision between two given alternatives, and in simply stating the alternative is very clear which one must be chosen. So it's not surprising that, as an epigram he chooses for his book, there it is. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life that you may live. This is Deuteronomy 30:19. So the only choice becomes simply cutting back on the carbon footprint along the path that he outlines. The sense of inevitability reinforced by this idea of speaking from the future. And, you might hope that, you could find space then for genuine choice in his elevation and empowerment of future generations. Perhaps if we can avoid the crisis, they'll be free to develop an open-ended future. It turns out, however, that here's his message to future generations. He says, seen from the vantage point of space, our beautiful planet is the Garden of Eden for all humankind, both living and yet to be born. In our time, without realizing it at first, we attained the knowledge and power to destroy it. For us then, and for you now, once again, as in the ancient scriptures, the issue is whether we have the wisdom and self-restraint needed to avoid that outcome and whether we would use them. Our sacrifice and self-restraint, in other words, is to ensure that future generations enjoy the possibility of sacrifice and self-restraint. So I think what our actions really need to do around energy is not so much that they're going to determine the lives of future generations for good or ill, but rather by pursuing our own interests and our own needs for more energy. We will build an infrastructure, build up technology and innovation, which will then allow future generations to determine their own lives.
Just to take up something that Martin Haig first said, he said that the energy challenge is indeed the biggest challenge we face in the world today. Perhaps like the panelists to reflect on why that is, and whether there's just been a quantitative change in terms of the need for more energy, or if there's been some sort of qualitative change in why we feel that energy is the biggest challenge today, and why discussions about it seem so angst-ridden instead of just sort of getting on with it. Why do we confront it as such a problem? And is there perhaps a problem indeed in seeing energy as the sort of key to all these solutions and the elevation of energy as the be-all and end-all, which is something that Joe just referred to. So just any thoughts on that? Perhaps, Martin, you'd like to speak in?
Maybe I should make... I thought I said one of the biggest challenges. I know if you tend to work in energy, you tend to see the world through a bit of an energy-centric outlook. So I do apologise to all other sectors of the economy and all other parts of society for that energy-centric comment, if I didn't say one of the biggest. But I think it's one of the biggest because of the environmental issue. I take the climate change challenge seriously. I do think we have to do something about that. And the difficulty with changing our energy system quickly and other land use changes as well, the emissions of greenhouse gases from land use change are extremely serious and very difficult to stop. The way we're currently going suggests that this is going to be something that takes us decades. We take our energy for granted, but we're using it all day long for all sorts of different things, and it's embedded in all the products that we buy. And that, both the production of energy and the use of energy, has got to be sort of changed, and that's why it's so pervasive and such a large issue.
Two things. One, it's become wrapped up in geopolitics, so it's become part of the security discussions and so on, and it will become more so. But two, just the flip side of the coin, amongst a certain group of people, yeah, sure, it's one of the biggest issues. I don't think it's a huge issue out there.
No, you probably.
I really don't think it's seen as a huge political issue out there. If you ask, you took a straw poll in London, people would come up with all sorts of stuff before they mentioned energy.
You're right in the sense that it's not number one preoccupation in people's minds. But I think what that reflects very often is that it's just a taken for granted assumption that we live in a limited world, and there's a limited extent to which we can expand or should expand the production of energy. And in that sense, it becomes a kind of framing presumption for a lot of other discussions, like discussions of security or any of these other sorts of problems.
The important thing is the new technology. And so, Mark, you said an awful lot about new sources of electricity, which is very important. And I suppose with plugged-in hybrid, that will solve some of the problems. But it looks to me you also need a form of liquid energy. Be interested to know what the panel thinks about that. Biomass has been suggested. It said you need so much space, it's not practical. I read a lot about algae. It would seem to make sense. I've done a few back of the envelope calculations of the amount of sun that falls on the Earth and conversion rates, or what have you. Basically, do you think we will get a technological fix and not life, if you like, be benign, or do you think we'll really actually have to get by with less energy and life will be fairly horrid, certainly not the life we're living at the moment?
The way the discussion is going is kind of optimism-pessimism discussion, which I'm not really sure is very helpful in terms of working out the problem we have even in the UK in energy. The thing that I can't understand about the position we're in is why are we in a position where we haven't done anything about the poverty of our own energy supply? Why have we sort of failed to do that? And that to me sort of brings the political problem of creating your own sources of energy as something that's become very, very difficult for people to work out. The whole argument about nuclear power, for instance, is like a hidden discussion. No one wants to talk about it at all, but it's flipping obvious. We're just about to shut down our nuclear power stations. Why can't we build some more? And why haven't we developed fusion properly over the last 25 years when Britain was at the forefront of it? So instead of saying, the end of the world is nigh, no, it's not. The problem is we've collapsed in terms of our own ability to deliver a very basic commodity that we all need, which is our own energy supply.
I'm very perturbed that in all your discussions first of all, you only consider the UK, which is 2% of everything. You really have to think about solving the climate. You have to think about the world. It's a very, very narrow focus that you are concentrating on. Two quick points. One, if you want a new energy technology, and I'm fed up with saying this at this thing, my company has it. It can produce electrical energy at the same price as fossil fuel energy. Give us, it's solar power based, give us 10% of the Sahara Desert, we can supply all the energy that the world needs at the same price as fossil fuel energy. Now, why on earth anyone isn't taking this as I don't know. You're going to buy gas-fired power stations. They produce stacks of CO2 still. CCS, carbon capture and storage, is 1 million miles off being a technology. And it'll push the price up of your power up anyway by 30%. And the reason why we haven't done renewables, as the Vice President of Shell told me yesterday, they can't make money out of it. The thing about oil and gas, it's a fantastic form of energy. It's fantastic. We know it. Companies like Shell know how to use it, how to exploit it, and make money out of it. You try and do that with solar. Shell have failed for 12 years on solar. You try and do it with wind. Wind energy is absolutely unproven technology. It's going to be at least 60% more expensive for the North Sea. The windmills on average operate for 25% of the time, so you need a massive standby power. In our last cold spell this year, when we really needed the heat, there was no wind in the North Sea.
All right, thank you.
The gentleman there, you were asking, why haven't politicians got to grips with this? It's partly because politicians love living in cloud cuckoo land when there's no need to tackle awkward issues. Energy has been extremely cheap, relatively speaking. And just when we were struggling with coal, we got a lot of gas. So things seemed very smooth. Things are very smooth and easy. Nuclear power, leaving aside all the other questions, I'm happy to go into nuclear power. We're all very bored of that debate now, and I'm happy to have it. But it's been relatively expensive, so that's why we haven't been building nuclear power stations until we've felt there's an energy crunch and we really need to. Fusion has been, as long as I can remember, it's been a brilliant idea 30 to 40 years in the future. And that's what it was in 1980 when I first came across it, and it feels like it's the same thing now. So I think we can get, probably over-optimistic. I think the gentleman, I assume you're referring to concentrated solar power. Yeah, I find that very exciting, concentrated solar power. It's why I hedge things around when I talk about dangers of long supply lines and so on, why I hedge things around, because obviously if you're importing stuff down massive interconnectors from the middle of the Sahara, you have got an extremely long supply line. It is a fascinating point. Can I just respond briefly to the Technofix one? I think there are a whole range of different technological advances coming down the thing. Algal biofuels, as you talk about. I think also in transport, it's fascinating the combination, probably, as I see it, and Martin would probably know more about this than me, that probably a combination of electric cars and hydrogen as transportation fuels holds out all sorts of possibilities. If electric cars come on stream in the way we're hoping to, it completely change the way we do grid balancing and so on. So there's all sorts of positive possibilities on that.
Question of why do we have this kind of slow, gradual sense of decay around infrastructure in the UK, which I think is a critical question here. According to Gore, the problem with long-term decision-making and the reason that we haven't made more progress is that the stress of modern life and manipulation by the advertisers has, he said, taken offline our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, like over here, yeah, which apparently is the part of the brain that keeps us, quote, on course once we decide to pursue a value-based goal over a long period of time. I would offer an alternative explanation to this one, but the reason that it's in contrast to that is precisely that we have reduced our choice, our understanding of kind of the value of what we can do with energy to, the stress of modern life and the manipulation by advertisers, a terrible thing that kind of we want to get away from, has essentially dominated the discussion to such an extent that, we just muddle through. We seem to have muddled through again with the recession, which has potentially kind of reduced energy demand for the next couple of years, and kind of people say, okay, happy we can build a little bit more gas, and that'll kind of keep us going. But what is needed here is a sense that actually producing more energy is not simply about kind of producing more stress of modern life, more manipulation by advertisers. Producing more energy and creating more modern life all around the world is something which increases human freedom that we want to build upon.
There's a number of questions, a number of them related to technology development. I think quickly we've probably neglected in the UK the situation probably for a couple of reasons. One is that we increasingly realise that very large scale, no energy source is ideal, and it precipitates various sorts of opposition that makes difficult problems. And the other thing is that politicians have restrictions over how much they can act when the public likes their energy very cheap. And so that combination of things has made things a little bit difficult to invest. But we increasingly realise that we need to crack on with it. But nevertheless, I went to a panel a couple of weeks ago where Lord Howell was there, and he heard all these people talking about all these new things that were going to cost more. And he said, what you're asking me, in the words of sort of Sir Humphrey, is to be very brave. As a Foreign Office Minister. On the issue of technologies, yes, there will be lots of exciting new energy technologies coming forward. I think it's worth distinguishing maybe between energy sources and energy conversion technologies. The energy sources that we know about are probably all the ones that we can rely on. Almost all of the energy sources, whether it's oil or coal or biomass or wind, go back to actually ancient times. Only because there was with a colleague at work, we did a little bit of looking into this, and the earliest references to solar photovoltaic and nuclear go back almost just over 100 years. 1905, in one of the journals of physics, talked about the speculation for that. So all that's to say is that we need to be, given the time frame of the changes that we've got to make, we have probably all of the main pieces of the jigsaw known to us that we can use. However, the conversion of the technologies, conversion of those energy sources is probably something that we should see develop. The question is how quickly we can build them up at scale. And I've had and various other colleagues had a lot of challenges to say, oh, well, that's too slow, you need to sort of have outlooks that go much, much faster. So together with a colleague, Nature printed a paper that we wrote saying, well, when humans have done well deploying energy technologies in the past, how quickly have they been able to scale it up? And the answer is, from the first pilot projects, companies building a pilot project to do algae or to do LNG or to build nuclear power stations like Calder Hall in the 50s. There was one at the same time in Russia as well, in Moscow. To get from there, that sort of scale, up to 1% of the world's total primary energy is 3 orders of magnitude. So that's a factor of 1,000 in terms of deployment. And that takes 30 years. Typically, when things have gone well, they've taken 10 years for every order of magnitude. Now, that is a compound annual growth rate of 26% per year. So that is very good going. That's not shirking on the job. After that, things tend to level off because for other reasons. So the question is that, yes, there will be a lot of exciting technologies. We shouldn't sort of get into a slough of too much despondency, but we do need to be realistic that this will take time.
I wanted to take issue with something Martin Wright said, and that was that energy wasn't a fundamental human need. You likened it wasn't, as important as food and water, but I think that's rubbish. I think, in fact, energy use is one of the key things that defines what it is to be human. Perhaps that's why people demand that it should be cheap. I think, in fact, it's as important as food and water and shelter. In fact, if you ever go on a survival course, believe me, they'll tell you to make a fire long before they tell you to do some other things. So in that sense, perhaps your calls for the rationing of energy should be seen as undermining what it is essentially to be human. And I'm no economist, but I can't help thinking that advocating the reduction of energy use is going to be counterproductive in the sense that it's going to stymie the incentives that will be important in developing viable alternatives in the first place.
I am vastly amused by Martin's call to make energy efficiency sexy. I'm even more amused that he thinks it's a neglected issue. All over the world, not just in the UK, McKinsey, the Jesuits of capitalism, refer to gains in energy efficiency as being the low-hanging fruit, a delightful management metaphor. And that was what Gordon Brown's programme was, insulation, insulation, insulation. It's what the Tories' programme is, where their Green Deal, not the Green New Deal, you understand, that would be too Rooseveltian, but a kind of Green Deal that they'll get into bed with B&Q and those other forces for technological progress for us. And you must be familiar, Martin, you're in charge of Green Futures, but you know that Jevons, the neo-marginalist economist from the 19th century, concluded that as you got more efficient with energy use, you tended to do other things and actually use more energy. So if you insulate your loft, you will save some money, although not in the first few months, as far as I'm aware, unless I'm afflicted by Wandsworth Council, where I live. And then you will say, well, look, I'm going to go and go for a weekend break in Seville. I'm going to get that money that I saved on the boiler and spend it on a naughty jet fare somewhere else. So I don't think energy efficiency can be sexy. Felt is felt. And, it's never going to be very sexy. And the problem that, the metaphor you used is, why put a windmill or wind turbine, more accurately, on the top of your loft when, you're blowing all the energy away and, you should fix your loft? Well, if it's a powerful enough wind turbine, which is a very big if, as we learned from the David Cameron episode, I'd rather, put a piece of Meccano on my roof than have power gen crawling around my loft for about 6 months, cladding my walls, knowing all of my intimate personal habits. Let the energy be blown away, providing we're generating it enough. And this is just to conclude, storage may be okay, transmission may be okay, no doubt we've got a lot to do on all of that, but energy generation, Mr. Shell, and I hate to criticise a sponsor, but I have the numbers on you. You are spending 0.2% of your annual revenues on R&D. Is it enough to give us the new forms of energy generation that a new century demands?
All right, thanks.
I think a member of the panel stated that fusion was something sort of way in the future. I think the National Ignition Facility, NIF, in San Francisco, has predicted that it's going to be carrying out the first demonstration of nuclear fusion within the next 6 to 9 months. This could be a pretty major announcement here. And it just makes me wonder in terms of, I know Martin pointed out that if you spoke to most people on the street about some of the pressing issues, then they're going to be talking about health, they're going to be talking about immigration, they're going to be talking about a whole rafter of other issues. Energy probably isn't going to feature particularly highly. Well, I'd argue because that's because people haven't been confronted with energy as an immediate issue. But this issue is coming. It just makes me wonder that while Britain seems to lead the world in science and other energy theories such as nuclear fusion, it really is at the forefront of the world, why we're not more aware of this and why we're not spending more on this.
Energy versus food and water. I'm not saying that energy isn't hugely important. I said it's that we don't always need energy to get some of the things which we currently use energy for, like, for example, heating our homes. If we are heating our homes by burning loads of energy when our homes are very poorly insulated, then we're being a bit silly. We're using energy for a result, a warm, comfortable home, we don't necessarily need to use energy for. So that's the distinction between energy and food and water. I'm not in favour of energy rationing. I find that an appalling notion. Reducing energy reducing energy use isn't always going to be a negative effect on the economy. If you're wasting money by burning energy when you don't need to, then you can probably do business more efficiently. Energy efficiency and sexiness, James. Well, we still don't do it nearly enough. Felt is felt, but money is money. People find money quite sexy. So I'm quite surprised that people are not doing more energy efficiency, given that there is the scope for it. I think it's appalling that there's not really, really thoroughgoing programs of insulation in hard-to-heat homes. We still have a huge problem with fuel poverty. It still isn't being done. People have been talking about it for years. There are a few go-ahead councils who are doing it. Most of them aren't doing it. It's a very simple, straightforward thing. It's one of the most useful interventions the government could make, and they're still not doing it far enough. Displacement spending, yes, of course it happens. I don't think it happens quite to a sort of a logical extent. I have saved £275 on my electricity bill. I will therefore bugger off to Malaga for a week. I don't think it works quite so neatly as that. But yeah, it certainly happens. Displacement spending certainly happens.
You need to be a little bit careful because lots of the big new projects that Shell deploys might not count as R&D officially on the accounts, but involve lots of deployment and development of new technology. So it depends. Shell renewables for quite a while might not have counted as R&D in the profit and loss, but is effectively a form of R&D. What else was there? There was fusion's come up a couple of times. I think fusion's done quite well actually out of the funding for limited amounts of sort of research budget. The UK is part of the project at Cadarache in France, of course. Let's hope that comes up with some goodies. The American announcement, the South Koreans, I think, have got projects on this as well. We've got our own research in Oxford. So we're all looking at this and keeping an eye on it. But let's be, again, when are we going to have sort of gigawatts of electricity to deploy and all this stuff? It's not sort of immediate. So that's probably something like some of the deep engineered geothermal technologies. These are probably second half of the century solutions at scale. Jevons paradox, I was very glad to hear that brought up. That raises a very interesting sort of point, which is about the fact that the energy system is dynamic, and you make a change somewhere and you find that something else pops out. My boss has this way of referring to the energy system as a balloon, that you squeeze it somewhere and something pops out elsewhere. It's not to say that efficiency is something that we should ignore or we should decry, but it's not straightforward that any efficiency use will immediately translate into that amount of reduction. It does show why you have to decarbonise and transform your energy system for environmental reasons at the same time.
Well, I think that there are plenty of promising technologies being developed, and I think we've heard about many of them. I think certainly there's many new possibilities in nuclear, there's many possibilities in solar energy. I think that biofuels, I think somebody mentioned, have great potential, certainly in terms of genetically engineering new systems to produce new custom fuels and to get beyond ethanol and so on. So I think there's a large number of possibilities there. I think the problem with all these technologies, all these possibilities that are there, on the one hand, we've heard, I think it's broadly right, it takes a matter of decades to go from nothing up to start making a significant contribution to the world energy supply. And there is the stark contrast with the lack of investment that we've seen certainly in this country more seriously than somewhere like China. And I think in that context it's probably too complacent to say that fusion and technologies of this sort are getting enough backing. Because we know that the amounts of investment required to actually push these things forward, and the amount of time that that's going to take, there is not enough long-term investment in these things that are really going to pay off. Primarily because the agendas are, set to the next few years. The sense of the kind of gun being held to the head, the kind of rambling in the short term, and the sense that these options, whether they're the kind of fears around the kind of Craig Venter genetic engineering for biofuels, whether it's the fears around the nuclear, in that context, the fears are always going to win out over the kind of longer term determined investment.
As somebody relatively uninformed to this debate, I feel I've learnt a lot from the session, and I feel I could sort of summarise to my sort of 6-year-old nephew that we've got this huge, great big energy crisis and problem. But what I wouldn't be so good at answering would be, how are we coming up with these solutions? Perhaps one of the panellists could give me a clear sort of succinct summary on who are working on the answers, who are figuring out the solutions. I'm sure there's I should know this, but I don't. Obviously you've got the energy suppliers, academic researchers. What's the strategy? Who's working on these solutions and these answers? And then the other point I'd really like, the gentleman in the leather jacket mentioned that there's this technology available with solar panels that, a certain proportion of the Sahara could be filled with these solar panels that would have enough energy. I'd really like a good answer to his question, so that I feel a bit more informed. Thank you.
To respond to the kind of complacency and cynicism about fusion always being 30 to 40 years away, don't forget that investment is not static. Investment doesn't actually, neither does it increase in fusion. It's worth reporting that in the last 3 months, not only has the European Parliament voted to cut funding to ITER in France, right, which is slipped under the radar only a few weeks ago. Previous to that, the Obama administration is quibbling with the National Ignition Facility in California because, and this is the perverse irony, it's quibbling over continued funding because it hasn't come up with ignition already. That's the insanity of it. So with that kind of ferocious Philistinism at the level of policymakers and politicians, it's no surprise that long-term major innovations are always going to be that bit further away.
Renewables are uncontrollable. For all the time I spent at British Aerospace, I never saw the windsock on the airfield move beyond extra limp. I'm sorry about the Severn barrage because the bore would still every mine. And all that happened was the tidal range would have gone from 14 to 7 metres. The good news is carbon capture and storage works. There's a lot of CO2 already stored for years in the North Sea, and it hasn't escaped, and Imperial are doing research on it as well. There's another coalfield under the North Sea in the northeast, and they're debating how to get it out. But we must start our nuclear power stations as soon as possible. But they can't be switched on and off very fast, so we need the mix.
In terms of Martin Wright's, I'm not going to have a go at you, Martin, because I was actually inspired in some way by your demand for like a new revolution, never before seen since the Second World War type rhetoric that you had. My only worry is that what that's coloured by in terms of mindset today, because it's good in terms of rhetoric, but I just wonder how it's actually going to be played out in reality, because the demand management model, which you then went on to talk about, the framework of restraint, sort of kind of colours two things. One is the recession and austerity budget which we're going through at the moment, so I'd be quite interested to find out what the panel think about the way that austerity is playing out in reducing our demand, and whether that's a positive thing, and whether that actually creates innovation or is just a terrible austerity. And the second thing is actually how kind of restraint itself can be argued to be a dampener on actually ambition, and how that reflects in the mindset of innovation. Surely by actually having a sense that we should reduce demand, then our notion about what innovation is and about what future we have to claim in the first place actually will be reduced. So we actually impose a limit at the starting point.
Okay, picking up on some of the things that people were saying, I think the need for a little bit of government commitment and leadership on this is essential. It isn't going to happen without that. Severn barrage, yeah, I'd like the Severn barrage. I'm sorry they're not going ahead with the Severn barrage. I disagree with you about carbon trading. I think potentially that could be one of the most socially progressive forms of fiscal instrument that also get a good result in terms of environment and energy, etc., that we could imagine, although it's a bloody nightmare to try and set up. So I'm not naive about that, and I've no idea if it's going to happen or not. Demand management, if you're constraining demand, it's not necessarily all about restraint. I mean, one of the most interesting things going on in energy at the moment is the involvement of the IT sector doing some really, really smart work in terms of making systems work much more efficiently, that word again. This is innovation in order that we use less stuff. I don't see why that's to do with sort of restraint or anything like that. It has nothing to do with the recession-induced downward curve in energy consumption. Finally, somebody said about who's going to deliver it. There was the gentleman up there. I mean, obviously you've got all sorts of people engaged in this. I think one of the most interesting and encouraging things has been the rise of some energy entrepreneurs, people like Shay Agassi of Better Place, who's helping make electric vehicles much more viable. There's all kinds of stuff that's happening out there. Energy entrepreneurs perhaps giving a little ray of hope.
How to solve the energy crisis? I think there are a lot of immediate energy investments that could be made. I think there's a problem both in the public sector and the private sector here, which speaks to the austerity and the recession in terms of government investment that would be very useful to give a lead around some of these questions like nuclear power, where there's a clear kind of political component to the decisions going forward. I think you can see banks have become very hesitant in a more general sense about many investments and risky investments. So I think you can see that playing out with both in the US and the UK. In the US most recently, nuclear power stations being cancelled in the US on the basis that the US government would not grant loan guarantees. Not so much loans, but the guarantees if it goes wrong that the bank will get its money back. What you can see there is the bank saying, well, we could invest, we could make a profit, it's a bit too risky. The state then backing off, not being prepared to kind of back these things through. You find the public sector and the private sector each kind of, you first, and neither really taking the plunge. So I think we need more from both. And the final thought then just on the efficiency question, I think the Jevons paradox, as was mentioned, is not just about accountancy and money. I think, we can look at it a bit deeper. The ultimate point of efficiencies and savings is that, you can use them for something else, to do more in life and to do more with the world. And that's, the basic reason why efficiency is not going to land up with using less.
Okay, I think one of the comments earlier on was to criticise the parochial view of just looking at the UK. I think I need to apologise for that because that was me who started that off, even though I tried to introduce it by encouraging broader debate. So you're quite right, and I'm very glad that nobody followed my lead and that everybody started talking about energy more broadly, because that's very important. It was just my own too narrow interpretation of this specific question. I think there are lots of people working on this. Energy is a rising issue within society. The investment community particularly is getting increasingly interested in this. I think we'll see more and more work coming out of the investment community on how a lot of this is going to be financed. There's still an issue, the main issue is how to make it profitable, though. I know that was sort of decried, but an awful lot of this stuff is more expensive than fossil, and while that's the case, it's difficult for it to happen on its own, and it's going to need help for a while. There was a specific question about the what's going on with those solar panels in the desert. So there's a very exciting project called Desertec, and I would have a look at that on the internet. DESERTEC. The Germans are in the Germans are sort of particularly in the lead on that, but that will involve building a very ambitious transmission network from North Africa up to, well, if it gets this far, maybe serve the Mediterranean first. But anyway, yes, I think there's been lots that's been talked about that's quite sort of inspiring. I'm trying to encourage people to look at the positive side of the use of energy and the development of energy, because that probably and hopefully will encourage more people to get involved, and that's what we need.
All right, good. A positive note. Can we thank all our speakers?